keynote this inaugural effort. As you know, the school here has, long before it was named the Ridge School, or the Ridge College for Intelligence Studies and Applied Sciences, long before it was named that, it had developed a reputation in both the public and private sector of very talented students, skilled in the acquisition of information, the analysis of information, the synthesis of information, and being able to take it down to a work product and give it to decision makers. And this school, over the past 10 or 15 years, has elevated its visibility in both the public and private sector in developing some strong intelligence analysts. And in the 21st century, when the data and information is the key to decision makers, whether you're in the public or private sector. So the notion that the Mercyhurst would convene an international forum to bring in intelligence professionals from, what, 6, 7 countries?
Yes, sir.
And it's going to expand. I mean, this is the inaugural effort. Pleased to be here. But if you took a look at the summaries of the panels and some of the papers that they've written, and you better appreciate, and I certainly appreciate, the work and the importance of the intelligence community writ large. You know, the Department of Homeland Security was a consumer of intelligence. I mean, I go back to my days in Vietnam. You go from basic little battlefield intelligence the military uses all the way to the Department of Homeland Security, and you think about it, and I used to think about it in these days, in these terms rather, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You probably have, I think, over 100,000 men and women in a dozen plus intelligence-related agencies taking human intelligence, electronic intelligence, open source intelligence, multiple sources of intelligence, put it in a funnel, and then in that 24-hour period, gets down to a product. I got a limited product dealing with terrorism. The president gets a much more robust product. But the bottom line is you got literally thousands and thousands of people that every single day, just in government alone, in order to providing the decision makers relevant information upon which they may or may not act upon. And Mercyhurst has developed an extraordinary fine reputation in building and equipping and motivating young men and women to take on that enormous responsibility of providing the robust and rigorous analysis and handing that to decision makers. They don't predict the future, but they certainly can shape it based on their analysis of events. So it's a pleasure to be associated with the inaugural event. Sorry, there was no soundbite in there. How are you going to cut that out, take it off TV and play it? That's your job, not mine. But let me just say that this school has developed a global reputation for excellence in intelligence studies. I'm very pleased to be associated with it and honored that I'd be invited to give the inaugural address. The world, which is even far more perilous today than it was in 2001. I mean, the old intelligence folks probably long for the days of the Cold War, but the multiplicity of threats, the nation-state actors, the sub-state actors, kinetic threats, digital threats, I mean, there's so much more out there that I think would attract a young man or woman in the notion that I want to contribute either to the public or private sector and bring my intellectual skills, my work ethic, and my mental agility to try to help decision makers and then give them the kind of information they need to affect the future. So I think it's a very, and the beautiful thing about intelligence analysts, you don't have to go to the government, you don't have to go to the CIA, you don't have to go to the intelligence agencies. There's plenty of opportunities within the private sector to provide the same kind of critical service to decision makers.
Are you ever surprised at how much less talk there is these days about terrorism and how much that's fallen off the public discourse?
Well, I'm not surprised to a certain extent, and this may almost be counterintuitive, the fact that we're no longer obsessed with it. Look, let's face it, the environment post 9/11, for the first year or two, everyone was waiting for the next major assault on our way of life and American citizens. And so I think we finally have the terrorism threat in its perspective, in the sense that it is now understood to be a permanent condition, but a risk which we can manage. And one of the ways we manage it is through the Department of Homeland Security, and one of the ways the Department of Homeland Security manages it is taking advantage of the information and analysis provided by those thousands of people in the federal government. The message today would be a couple of elements to it. One, based on my own experience, tremendous admiration and respect for the intelligence community. Secondly, the message is there's no substitute for good intel. You can be as intuitive as you want, but intel, it drives the decision makers in both the public and private sector. And thirdly, I remind them, although they need not be reminded, that their world today is far more critical to the safety and security of this country than it's ever been before. And if you just list it, and I don't have to remind this group, but spin the globe. You got 5 theaters of war now: air, land, sea, space, cyber. You got kinetic and digital threats. You got unrest around the world. You got nation states and sub-nations like militias and terrorists, and the list goes on and on and on. And so, as I said before, the intelligence community probably longs for the days of the Cold War, where we just focused on the Soviet Union and 3 dimensions of war, and things were a little, as perilous as they were, they're just not as complex and perilous as they are today.
We're talking a lot about Iran. What is your concerns about the Middle East, and what are the possibilities that American lives may get put in harm's way trying to mitigate the threat that Iran poses?
Well, I think right now, without undervaluing or underplaying the threat that I think Iran is writ large to the broader global community, I don't believe they pose an imminent threat to the United States directly. They pose an imminent threat to allies and potentially to the global economy if you start closing up the Straits of Hormuz. That's a lot of the traffic in and out of that. It's global traffic, heavily energy-centric. So I think both sides are doing a little bit of posturing right now. I think we have to be very careful not to precipitate a crisis. I just noted that today the president announced 1,000 more troops going over. We got I'm not so sure we have a carrier group, but I do think we have an Air Force carrier over there. So I look at it thinking right now there's kind of a pugilistic, provocative arrogance on behalf of the Iranians from time to time. I think the president is just sending these troops in to remind them that we still are the strongest military in the world. So when he meets, I suspect, with Putin and Xi and the G20, it's in the global interest to make sure that nothing incendiary happens in that region. And I suspect that will be the outcome, but right now both sides are just trying to flex and, frankly, remind each other of who they are, their personalities. Understand that terrorism is going to be a fact of life.
So we can start going to
forevermore.
so we take it seriously.
Frankly, we take it seriously, but in relationship to the other risks, you have a Russian nationalism and ascendancy over there with Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and you've got the emergence of President Xi and the economic and military ascendancy of China. You've got North Korea and Iran. Certainly there's a certain arrogance and provocative nature of the kind of things they do and say, in addition to everything else. So you put it in the perspective of all the other threats directed to this country. You take it as a serious threat. You deal with it every single day. But I think we finally, in the aggregate, put it in its proper place.
You comfortable with U.S. policy?
Well, I'm not sure what, I'm trying to figure out what the policy toward what. I mean, I just, my concern right now is you take a look at around the rest of the world, I'm not sure I could articulate for you or anybody else what is America's strategic policy going forward. We're transactional, we're anecdotal, we respond to this, we respond to that. So I don't know. The question asked about Iran. I'd like to think that the president has decided to send 1,000 more troops because it was a recommendation of his military advisors and his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor in order to send a signal to Iran that we take open seas and the straits through which a lot of global commerce passes. We take our responsibility as a member of the global community to keep that open, so be aware. So who knows? But right now, I can't exactly articulate what an overall strategic engagement policy is from the
Consistent
administration.
policy? Sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Couldn't articulate it. Perhaps I'd let Secretary Pompeo do it for you. And again, it goes back to the couple of the earlier questions we've had here. You know, people are saying, what should we do and when should we do it? And so I remember coming off a press conference. I had Bob Mueller and I had General Ashcroft and we read the threat and we were going to tell everybody it was over a holiday and, you know, these are the threats. We want you to be careful, be serious, blah, blah. And then walked off the podium. And I remember walking down and talking to a couple of people, and I said, we got to do better than this. So let's try to design a system so that America could get the general idea of what the intelligence community and what the administration thought the threats were. So we looked at the Department of Defense, we looked at the Department of State, we decided to come up with colors, we had numbers. And then it served its purpose. It was also great fodder for this. The night talk shows. I mean, should it be chartreuse? Should it be fuchsia? Should it be this or that? But it served its purpose. But ironically, you know, and it's changed, it's evolved. But I still thought it was a good idea because then it wasn't reported. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job explaining it. Depending on the level, there was also not a mandated, but a recommended level of security. It was basically for government. So if it's this color, you ought to be here. If it's this here, if it's down here, you ought to be down here. So. But it was an interesting time, and I'm sure that and duct tape. The color-coded system and the duct tape will be probably mentioned at some point in time when the good Lord says, your number's up, pal. So I think, I'm not even sure they use the system anymore, but back then, again, it shows you how things have changed since 01, 02, 03, and 04. We now accept terrorism as a global condition, but that some people would argue, and I think it's appropriate, that more people have died of violent, massive assaults with automatic weapons in this country from Americans on Americans than have died from a terrorist attack. That doesn't mean you're not mindful of terrorism, but you're finally putting things in perspective, although terrorism has been a tool for centuries and centuries and centuries, which is the first time that America ever had to deal with it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, whatever. I haven't seen
Do you
one.
mind?
Yeah, anything else?
So, Governor Rich, when we talk about terrorism, I think we're all thinking along the same lines, but I more and more am thinking, mostly because Mercyhurst is so engaged in this area now, cybersecurity.
Oh, yeah.
Can we ever really protect ourselves from that kind of threat?
No, I think whether the threat's kinetic, whether it's digital, whether it's all about accepting the threat, accepting the risk, and managing it. It's just the digital world. I mean, we're one of the preeminent digital programs now. It's really, I wish I could stay and listen to a couple of the panel discussions on cyberspace and cyber threats and how you deal with it. But the fact of the matter is that there is no fail-safe, guaranteed cyber defense system. And the ubiquity of the internet is its strength. The ubiquity of the internet is its weakness. And for all the promise of the digital age and all the promise of the information age is equivalent peril. You might think it's exciting to have 20 to 25 billion devices hooked up to the internet by 2022 or 2023, but everyone is a potential point of entry into that, into the digital world. So again, I think there's a place where Mercyhurst is on the kind of leaning edge. You got the intelligence studies and applied science, where you got the intelligence studies and the cyber world, and you pull them together. And again, these young men and women who graduate here could be prepared, plenty of job opportunities from students who take advantage of the joint disciplinary program here at the school. It's all about risk management. I mean, I remind people, everybody does. Everybody deploys their own self-risk management every day. They just don't think about it. I'm going to the drugstore. Do I put my seatbelt on or not? That's risk management. What's the risk of you being hit by a car? Nah, but an accident, the risk is slight. You can put your belt on. You're going to get a flu vaccine this year or not? Put an addition on the house. You're going to increase your insurance or not? For the golfers in Erie, PA, you got a nice round going. The lightning's bouncing around on the 16th green. At 17th hole, you're going to finish the round or not. It's all about risk management. I mean, how do you manage the risk? And it's much more challenging at the national level, that's for sure. But businesses, do I invest in this part of the world? There's a geopolitical instability. So the world is about risk management, but the intelligence community, that's what's so interesting about it. They will gather that information, distill it down, and help the decision makers around that risk. And hopefully they help them avoid whatever that risk be turning into a real crisis. So there's more need for that, and I think there's greater appeal to that now for a young student. But they got to be analytical in mind. They have to be willing to write. I mean, there's really some acute intellectual skills necessary to be a good analyst. Very acute intellectual skills. And we were a consumer of intelligence at DHS. I had my own shop. I had two great people who helped me set up the information analysis shop. One was Charlie Allen. Charlie was a 40-year veteran, almost at the CIA. People say you never went away from a conversation with Charlie confused. He was very direct, workaholic, very outspoken. The other man became a close personal friend was a Lieutenant General Pat Hughes. Pat started as an enlisted man in Vietnam, got all shot up. He got more medals, got a chest full of medals and honor from here, 37 years in the military. He ran the Defense Intelligence Agency. He came in with his little shop, and boy, I tell you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences there. I relied on them and their judgment and their analysis, and every once in a while, their analysis was different than the CIA's. And so there's an advantage of the competitive analysis. And so when you have professionals looking at the same range of data, the same level of information, and they differ on their conclusions, that's a healthy thing. It's a healthy, which makes it go a little bit deeper. The discussions are more robust. And I'll relate to this group. It affected me directly because I was charged with a particular briefing X number of days hence for the President of the United States, and CIA had one point of view and my shop had another point of view. And the President wasn't interested in 2 points of view. Okay, I got it. That's the way it was. So competitive analysis is good, very important.